Hello, everybody. Welcome back for another Tuesday training. We are going to get started in a couple of seconds. As normal, we're just waiting for a couple of people to still join. I can see some coming in. Thanks for joining. Appreciate it. We're going to look at some black and white today. Black and white photography tips, monochrome photography tips. We'll get started in 2 seconds. Great. Before we get started, just some admin again. There's a MailChimp email list if you want to get notifications and the link for the Tuesday training every week in your email inbox. In the description of this video, you'll find the MailChimp link. You can just join there. If you haven't joined the meetup group for Joburg Photowalkers, that's definitely a thing to do if you're based in Johannesburg. Really nice group. That's where all the photo walks are organized and put on. So go ahead and join the meetup group for Joburg Photo Walkers. Definitely worth it if you want to go on some amazing photo walks. Hey, welcome, Oscar. Thanks for joining. We're going to get started in just a few seconds. Now, before we start, on the topic of black and white photography, I made a bit of a post-it note here for me to remind me to mention something before we get started. Black and white photography is amazing. I love black and white photography. Been doing it a very long time, since the days of film photography. I like black and white film. There's just something special about black and white. Even from the film days and still now in digital, I think we often forget about black and white photography. If you open up your mobile phone, if you pick up your digital camera, by default everything is in color, and everything we do by default is in color. Since the advent of color film, I think, and also especially now in the days of digital, we very often forget about black and white, and it's a very special type of photography, I think, and you can do a lot and also use it as a tool to improve your photography overall. Okay. So my little disclaimer is, with black and white photography, I'm going to give you some tips. I'm going to give you some things to do. What I want you to do is try some of these tips as you go out. Specifically, maybe pick one, try and get a photo using that tip, and then go on to the next one as you practice. The only thing with these tips is that in reality, seeing the world in black and white and using black and white photography as you like to its full potential takes a lot of time and practice. So the more you do it, the more you take photos in black and white, the more you look at images in black and white, whether it's photo books or on websites or on social media, your own images in black and white. The more you do it and the more you look at it, the better you'll get. So these tips are helpful, and I think it's going to be good to do specific exercises. But my little disclaimer is, to get really good in black and white photography, you need to do it a lot, because the world around us, the way we see it, is actually in color, obviously. But we need to learn and train our eye to know what something will look like, or what a scene will look like when it's captured in black and white. And that takes a lot of training and a lot of effort, and I think you should spend a lot of time with black and white to get good at that. And the spin-off is your color photography will also get better as your black and white photography gets better. Okay, so that's my little disclaimer. And then just a couple of things before we start with the actual tips. Don't be afraid of using JPEG on your camera or your mobile phone, especially with our editing workflow these days coming back into Lightroom. If we're taking photos in RAW and in the back of our heads we're thinking, oh, we've got the color image, we can always convert it to black and white if we do want to in future. I think that takes away a lot of how you're training your eye in black and white. You actually set your camera to black and white, or you set a filter on your phone to black and white. And there's different ones available in the cameras these days, and also on your phones these days. There's like high contrast black and white filters. There's normal, just like monochrome filters. There's some film simulations that are in black and white on a lot of cameras and phones these days. They're all amazing. And the more you look at your actual viewfinder or screen or on the back of your camera or on your phone, and if you can see it in black and white already when you're capturing it, um, you'll get a better at black and white a lot faster. Don't just see black and white as something that you can fall back on after you've imported your images and you want to convert a couple of images to black and white. I think to get really good black and white, you should be shooting for black and white. So you should be already, while you're taking the image, you're thinking about black and white. It's not just something you do afterwards in an edit just because you want another version of an image. So yeah, that's my little tip there. So don't be afraid of trying all those simulations and black and white profiles and things in your cameras, whether it's mobile or your actual digital camera. They've got amazing profiles. And then if you're playing around with these, just save JPEG so that it's already black and white as it is saved, so you can see the results before you get into editing. Um, great. I've got a comment. Let me just quickly check. Yes. Oh, yeah, we can have a look at that after the training. There's time for questions. I'll come back to this one, Ina. Okay, perfect. Um, good. Then, yeah. Before we get going with the tips, just one thing. Um, switch your camera to black and white. Try JPEG, and also don't, when you're taking the photo, take it for black and white. Set your settings and what you're doing for black and white when you're shooting black and white. And the same with editing. Don't just edit a perfect version in color and then click the little black and white button or drop the saturation and think you've got a black and white image. Personally, I think black and white images should be edited and also captured very differently from a color image. Very often, black and whites can do with a lot more contrast than a color image. You could shoot at much higher ISOs when you're doing black and white. I think it gives black and white images a bit more character if you do. When you get to editing, you can definitely increase contrast more on most black and white images than what you would ever be able to do, and still get a good look in color. You can add things like grain in. You can stop doing things like noise reduction either in camera or in your editing. And all these things will give you a more authentic black and white feel, I think. So don't just see it as something that you do right at the end, just click the black and white button. See the whole process as I'm going to output a black and white image. Okay. Another little tip is take a day, take a week, take a month, maybe take a year and do your own personal photography in black and white. You will see the results also when you're doing color work, sure. Um, Seeing things like light and shadow is a lot easier when you're looking at a black and white image. So looking at contrast, looking at where your eye goes in an image, all these things are easier to practice when you're doing black and white. With color, the extra data that the color provides is just another distraction on top. And like I said, especially if you're doing things like portraits, maybe street photography, it's very good to do some black and white so that you can start practicing and seeing where your eye goes in an image and what you look at as that image comes up, or as you first look at something, where does your eye go immediately in that image. And by taking away the color information, you'll notice this a lot more. You'll notice what the shadows do, you'll notice what the highlights do. So I think personally, I think everybody should do some black and white. And I think most of us can do with taking more black and white images. Okay, let's hop into the training for today. Let me just share my iPad here. There we go. So today's training is 5 tips for better black and white photography. Good. I've got a comment again. Like previous sessions, just pop your comments, pop your questions into the chat. I'm happy to address them as they come up. I'll keep an eye on the chat. We've got one that the comment says that helps you to see in black and white. Absolutely. Being able to see in black and white is a really good exercise. I think It's good for our photography. For instance, I might be doing a studio shoot for portraits, and very often I would switch my display on my camera to black and white just to see where the shadows go on the face, what my lighting is doing. And it's easier to pick up in black and white and see what the image is doing than when I switch it over to color. Even if the end result might be color, even if my whatever the images I deliver to my client is going to be in color, very often I would just switch my camera over, especially when setting up and doing test shots. I would switch it over to black and white just to really get a feel for what's the shadows doing, what my lights are doing, all these things, and being able to see that as you're walking around as well and visualize what it's going to be doing in black and white, I think is really good. It teaches you a lot about light, and in the end, light is photography. So, yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's hop into the first tip: contrast. So this is my first tip. Don't be afraid of contrast. Use contrast to your advantage. Now, there's a couple of different ways you can use contrast. So there's general contrast in an image. I'm going to show you some examples now. So that's just everything from micro contrast, so that gives you more sharpening and detail, up to contrast in specific areas of the image. And the only thing that contrast is, if you think about it, it's your difference between light areas and dark areas. So use it to your advantage. Because the color information is not there, contrast is really key in getting good black and white images. You can set contrast up and down on your camera generally. You can also do it in edits afterwards. But think about contrast, and also when you're looking at a scene, think about where the high contrast areas will be. So try to get darker things closer to lighter things to get that contrast, because that's where your eye will be going. Okay, got a couple of examples where I'm using contrast. So this is the first one. As I opened up this image, my eye went straight to the guy having probably dinner, I think, when I took this image. So overall, his shirt is the brightest part of this image. So that's absolutely where my eye is going, and that's what I'm looking for in this image. So I want whoever's looking at this image to immediately see the person sitting there. And because he's got a white shirt on and the background behind him in that restaurant is very dark, pretty much black behind him, you get a very high contrast area right there. So the contrast between him and his shirt especially, and the black background, so you've basically got a black box in the middle of this image with a very white thing inside of the subject there, and so your eye goes straight there. What our eyes tend to do in black and white images is wherever the highest contrast is, that's generally where our eyes want to go. And a little trick with this is, if you sort of squint at an image, especially in black and white, as you squint and you lose some of the detail and it gets a little bit blurry, you'll notice these areas of high contrast. So either something white on something black, or something black on a white area. These high contrast areas tend to guide your eyes straight there. Okay, so this is one way of using contrast, and we need to think about contrast when we're shooting black and white. Next, another high contrast area. So this very bright image with a very bright sky and a very bright ocean there, with a very dark rock with a little figure on there. I don't know if you can actually see the figure there. There's a little figure on the rock. At a large size print, this is a little bit more obvious. But that dark area against the very light area gives you a lot of contrast. So that guides your eye again to that area. So the contrast can work both ways. Something light against something dark, or something dark against something light. That will make you look at a specific area. So in this case, this whole area on the right of the image is all very bright. So your eye won't be going there. Your eye will be going to that intersection of where the dark rock and the figure meets the sky and the ocean that's quite light. Okay. So that's another example of using contrast in black and white. It's a really useful tool. Okay, in this one, we're looking at contrast in a very different way. So I edited this one to have quite a bit of contrast, and I added contrast in my edit, and how I handled the tones. So if I show you the original image, it looks like this. So it's a very uniform, very gray, very mid-tone image. And in my edit, I enhanced the contrast. So what we're getting is a lot of local contrast. So there's lots of areas where there's bright and dark next to each other. And in the original image, there was a lot more different shades of gray against each other. Where the edit, I pushed some of the darker grays closer to black, some of the brighter grays I pushed over to the white side in my edit. And what's happening is we're creating micro contrast, so the image just appears sharper. It appears as if there's more detail, and that contrast just gives me that, that feeling of having more detail in the image. And it's not real detail in the actual capture. It's perceived detail, and it's due to that micro contrast in the image. Okay. Let me just check if there's any comments going. All good, all good. Let's carry on. So that was the first tip. Here's another image, contrast again. So what we're seeing here, your eye immediately goes to the area with the most contrast. So both when I captured this image and when I edited it, so I even enhanced it a little bit more. The whole idea is that the subject in this image, the guy walking in front, has got to be, in my mind, the highest contrast area. So for instance, his hat and his shirt is very dark, and the bags he's carrying is very, very bright, very white. And that contrast right there gives me the highest contrast area in this image. The rest of the image is mostly different tones of gray, closer to mid-gray. But this specific area where I want people to look is very high contrast. And that's another way of using contrast right there. So when you get brighter and darker areas close together, that's where your eye goes. Okay, so contrast, that's our first tip for tonight. The next one, this is an interesting one. I wonder how many people from the old film days can remember the color filters. Okay, color filters, these little things. I still got some. I still use some old film cameras, and I put these on every once in a while when I'm shooting black and white film. So the idea with these filters were that you put either a red or a green or an orange or a yellow filter on to capture a different black and white image. So some of us remember these, we use these, and it gives you a very specific change in your black and white image. And luckily today, we also find these different filters built into most digital cameras. So it's worth maybe taking the manual out and just having a look. Generally, this option in your camera, if your camera's got it, and most digital cameras that I've used in the last sort of 10 years, a lot of them, I would say, have got this option. So basically what you do is, as you switch over to a black and white color profile in your camera, this option becomes available, and generally you would have to first go to something like monochrome color profile, and then inside of that menu you will find your black and white filters. Okay, I for sure know that, for instance, Panasonic has got this, Olympus has got this, Fujifilm has got this. So you can set a filter because your sensor is actually capturing color when it's capturing the image, and then it's processing out the black and white. It can actually apply these, what we used to have, glass filters of different colors that we had to screw on in front of our lens to filter out specific colors. Now we can do it digitally. You just select the filter you want, so you can select a red or a green or a yellow or an orange or whatever you want, and the camera will then capture the image as if you had that piece of glass of that color in front of the lens. Now, what does this do? It does really cool things to your black and white images. So what it does is, if you put a piece of red glass in front of your lens and you're capturing a black and white image, the red glass allows red colored light or close to red through without changing anything. But the opposite color on the color wheel, in this case blue, will be darkened down, so it won't be letting blue light through. So what does a red filter do? It darkens down blue, so it darkens your sky. So you get these like Ansel Adams type landscape photos where your clouds, the white clouds, stay white, but the blue becomes really dark, okay, if you put a red filter on. An orange filter does a similar thing, but less so. So it's a less aggressive sort of filter. So it also darkens down the sky a bit. Yellow, even less so. Green does some very good things to some, when you're doing portraits. A lot of people, when you're putting a green filter on, their skin looks better. It doesn't work for everybody. You need to try it, but very often the green can do good things for portraits. So using these color filters is something that a lot of people forget that they actually exist. And also there's a way of editing this into, if you're capturing raw images, you can also do this in post. So you can apply a color filter or the look of a color filter when you're editing in Lightroom. Okay, so remember these color filters, and let me show you what it actually does when you apply color filters. So I'm going to simulate this in Lightroom. Let's open up my editing. We're going to go to the light panel. First of all, remember these three blocks. We've got blue, green, red. Okay, so we've got blue, green, red. Remember which one is which one, because we're going to turn this into a black and white image, and then I'll show you what the color filters do. Okay, so we've got a blue block, a green block, and a red block. Here we go. Let's get editing. I'm going to change the color profile to monochrome. So now we've got 3 gray blocks inside of Lightroom. Okay. Basically, we turned a color image into a black and white image. Now we want to edit it. Okay. If we go to the color panel and we go to gray mix, so in different versions of Lightroom and different editing software, it might be called black and white mix. But basically what you can do is you can get a panel where it shows all the colors. On Lightroom on the desktop, you will find that it shows all the colors as sliders, one below the other one, and you can move those sliders. On the mobile version, so the iPad that I've got here, or the iPhone, or any mobile device, you will find that it's got these little round toggles for the different colors. So you select one color and then you adjust that color. The other one, you've got all the colors as sliders and you can just slide them around. But what you are now able to do is select a color, even though we're already in black and white. We're looking at the image in black and white. I can select a color, for instance blue, and I can drag the color slider to the left. So that first block was blue. Look at what we're able to do. I can increase it to almost white. I can darken it down to pretty much black. So we can change the luminosity of one color in an image. Okay. That's quite nice. So this is the blue slider. We're changing that first block. We can put it back to where it was. We can go to red. We can darken down red. That's the last block. We can increase the luminosity or the luminance of the red, so we can make it almost white. We can darken it down to almost black. Okay. So we can adjust individual colors in our black and white image if we've got a color raw that came in with our image. So this is something that you can set the filter in your camera. If you're shooting JPEG, you have to do it before that JPEG is saved to get that filter effect. You could screw on that piece of glass that's that color if you're shooting film. Or if you've got a color image that's coming into Lightroom and you're converting it to black and white. So for instance, if you're shooting JPEG and RAW or just RAW, then you can use this slider inside of Lightroom. But you have to start with a color image when you're converting. Lightroom needs to know where the color is, even if it's showing you the black and white image. Okay. What was the other ones? Green. So we're doing green. There's the green dark. There's the green bright. So we can adjust individual colors and how bright they are. This is a really powerful way of getting interesting photos. And especially when you've got a landscape photo with clouds, being able to put a red filter on, whether it's digitally in post or a physical red filter to darken that blue sky down so that the contrast between the white clouds and the darker sky is just accentuated, is actually quite a nice thing to do. Okay, there we go. That's how we apply these filters inside of Lightroom. So you've got different places where you can apply them, and gives a very nice effect. Okay, next. This is loading. Okay, this is an image. Well, firstly, just going back to the previous tip, contrast. So I've got my subject and I timed it so that the dark clothing of the subject was against the whitest and brightest part of the scene there. So I first, walking around, I saw the sign. That was the first thing that caught my eye. I walked around to just get a nice frame. and I positioned that very bright part, that white wall, right in the middle. That's where I wanted it. And then I pretty much waited for somebody to come past wearing dark clothes. That's what I was doing. It took me quite a while just standing around get this shot. Um, yeah, the guy looking up at the sign was a bit of a bonus, but catching him right there in front of that bright background, or that white part of the wall with his dark clothing and his dark hat, that's what I was looking for. Okay, so that's going back to tip one with the contrast. The next thing, this tip where we're talking about the color filters, this image I actually captured in color. You can see the color version there, and that's the black and white version. So what I can actually do, because we can adjust colors in Lightroom, I can go to, for instance, my gray mix. I can go to green. That top part, you'll notice there's some green there around the sign. And if I want to darken that top part down, I select the green and darken down that top part to make the sign stand out a bit more. I can make it brighter. And this gives me nice control over specific areas in my image. So if somebody's wearing a red shirt, I can adjust how bright or how dark that area goes in my black and white image. So it's a very handy tool if you are bringing in a color image into Lightroom. And if you're shooting black and white, specifically black and white, I suggest saving on your camera a JPEG plus RAW. So you're shooting JPEG, you're getting your black and whites, you can review your black and white images, and then once you get into editing, if you do need to adjust the specific thing in the color image while it's going over to black and white, you've got that option. You don't always have to. It's just a nice option to have. Next one. This is another example of doing exactly that. So in an image like this, if I had a red glass filter on my camera and I was using black and white film, or I set my camera to black and white JPEG, then the blue sky would darken down. Okay. I can also do it by setting my camera to have a red filter. The blue sky darkens down. Okay. And to show you the effect in post, this is actually a color image that I brought in. If we adjust the luminance of the blue, so I've selected blue right here. If I darken down the blue, my sky goes darker. That's not the one. Oh, it's interesting. Oh, so I've already selected a black and white profile. I've set up a profile where I do exactly this in my edit. So you'll notice at the top I've got a black and white profile selected. Let me just do Adobe Monochrome and go back out of that. So now I've just got the standard Adobe Monochrome filter selected. So right here you can see what I've done is my blues, my dark blues, I've dropped down quite a bit. So the original sky would look something like this. There you can see the original sky. So the white clouds and the bright blue sky actually match quite closely. So there's not a lot of contrast in my sky. So if I want to get a bit of contrast and make the clouds stand out a bit, I just select blue and I can drop my blue a bit. And as I darken down my blue, the sky turns darker, and now my clouds stand out against that darker blue background. So that's just a little trick. And it's very much you get a similar sort of Ansel Adams sort of look where you're darkening down the sky and the clouds are still nice and white. Okay, so that's just another way of doing it. So this is basically either before when you're capturing or afterwards in post you're using color filters. Okay, next tip, number 3. We're going quickly through these 5 tips. The next one is use shapes. As soon as you strip away color from an image and there's no color and no distracting things when it comes to color and color contrast or bright primary colors in an image, which obviously you can also use to your advantage, but in black and white we're stripping all this color information away. So things like shapes becomes a lot more apparent. You can build shapes with actual objects that you find when you're walking around, shapes of buildings, shapes of pathways, anything that gives you nice geometric shapes that will guide your eye is really useful. So look for these shapes, because the effect that a shape has in your image will just be so much more pronounced in a black and white image. You can also look for shadow and light areas where the actual light shining onto something is giving you nice shapes. And in a color image, you might not notice these shapes as much, but in a black and white image, they become really prominent and they can guide your eye and they can make for really nice images. Okay, so look for shapes when you're walking around and doing black and white photography. So just simple example, there was light coming in from the side and it made that little triangle thing in the corner, and having somebody right there where that triangle is pointing gives a nice effect. So it's a simple example, but look for shapes, look for geometric shapes, and as you're walking around, use these things to your advantage when you're doing your photography. So that's one example. Here's another example with shapes. So there's a couple of things happening. One thing is on the side here, we've got some a very dark area with some buildings and shadow. So that just blocks off quite a bit of that image on the side, gives you some negative space. So your eye wants to go to the middle of this image. And then I've got these railings here, these steel railings on the side, and I've got all these lines basically pointing towards the taxi. Now in a color image, it might not be as obvious, but in a black and white image, those lines are very obvious, and it really guides your eye back into the middle of the image. Okay, so look for these shapes when you're walking around. Look at, maybe it's just one step to the side or to the other side. Maybe it's lowering your camera. Maybe it's raising it a tiny bit. But if you can use shapes or light and dark areas to guide your eye, that's definitely a good thing to do. Another example of shapes. So this is just shapes running into the depth of this image, and it gives you a much more pronounced feeling for what's going on than what you would find in a color image. So again, as soon as you go black and white, these shapes and lines that guide your eye just become so much more interesting and effective, I think. So again, there's some contrast between dark areas, light areas, and these. Then you get these shapes and lines that just help you. Yeah, it just gives an overall nice feel to an image if you've got these shapes and lines that you're actually using to guide somebody's eye. Okay. Next, still just some shapes. There's some lines running through. The diagonal lines, I think it makes it interesting. There's some darker areas, some lighter areas, and they just geometric shapes and triangles and lines and things can just give a nice feel to an image. And all these possibilities become so much more well, firstly effective, and you also just, yeah, it just gives you a lot more room for playing with images like this as soon as you go over to black and white versus color. Okay. Next, simplify. I think very often when we're taking images, when we're going about it back to front, I think. So with a lot of other art forms, what we're doing is we're creating something where there was nothing. We're starting, if we're painting, we're starting with a blank canvas and we're adding things until we're happy. If we are doing whatever, pottery or something, we're building something up where there was nothing. So most art forms, you're basically creating something and putting things together to create the end result. Where in photography, everything is there. You can turn around and look at everything around you and then decide where you're going to point your camera. So we actually have to go about it the other way. I think a very good way of using black and white is take everything away that's not needed in the image. Try and simplify backgrounds. Try and get subjects against very simple backgrounds in the image. Wait for somebody to walk into a part of the image where there's space around them. Complicated backgrounds can become very distracting and confusing in black and white because the color can't separate subjects with background. So you need to be aware of your framing and try different techniques of really simplifying black and white images. And very often another good technique for simplifying is getting close. So in a color image, you could be a few steps back and it might still be good. With black and white, what I found very often, you need to be really close and isolate the subject to get effective black and white. So this is another little tip: just simplify the compositions. Don't go for complicated scenes and compositions. Just try and simplify it as much as possible. Have one subject. Make sure your eye goes to that one subject. Simplify things. Um, so again, in an image like this, it's basically as simple as I could get this portrait. No background, it's all just black. There's no backdrop, there's no background, no light on the background. Um, the clothing is simple and dark. And I think being able to take everything that's not needed out of a photo is really beneficial when you're doing black and white photography. Um, another one, in this case, just having shallow depth of field. It's not something that I often do or something that I prefer doing. Sometimes shallow depth of field is a little bit of a it's an easy way of separating a subject with a background, and I think in modern photography it's very often overused, because sometimes you want somebody in the context of where they are. That's not something that I very often do, but in a case like this, I didn't have many options, and just simplifying it and making sure that that background is not distracting, I think, helps a lot. And also getting close. Two steps back would have been a very different image, where getting close and simplifying the frame, I think, helps a lot. Also, just where I positioned the camera to get basically this, it was a really friendly guy I met out in the city, but getting basically framing him where the wall is behind him, and not where I first started out was like a step to my right, which meant his head was right in front of where that building and all that clutter was meeting with the sky. So one step to the left allowed me to get him against that wall where it's a lot less distracting. So again, just simplifying things, moving your camera a little bit left, right, up, down, just to get whatever your subject is against a better background. And we often forget about this, and in black and white, it's key to make sure that your subject stands out from whatever their surroundings are. Another simple image. It's one light, super simple setup, very simple settings, quite underexposed, and just getting close and making sure there's nothing distracting, making sure that it's the simplest image I could get to convey the story. Okay. I think, um, yeah. So simplify, definitely. Okay. Let's carry on. Silhouettes. This is one of my favorite things when doing black and white. Silhouettes work so much better in black and white than in color. Very often it's such a fun thing to play with. It will teach you a lot about your camera and how to underexpose and how to get higher contrast images out of your camera. So practice doing silhouettes. As you do more of them, you'll get better, and also recognize scenes where you can actually get stuff to be silhouettes. In post, you basically want to raise your highlights and drop your darker areas, which is the opposite of what we would very often do in color editing. So you're basically creating more contrast. You're moving your brighter areas to be more bright, your darker areas to be more dark. You can do it in camera. You'd up your contrast when you set your monochrome profile. If you've got control of highlights and shadows separately in your camera, you can then also drop the shadows, up the highlights. So it's sort of the opposite that from what we would normally do in landscape photography, but it's really effective, especially in black and white, to have silhouettes. So we'll have a look at a few examples. This one was shot on 35mm film. Very nice. I think film still has a little bit of a different feel, a little bit more washed out than what we would normally get with digital, but I still like the feel of film. I could obviously still edit this image in Lightroom to get the dark areas darker, but the film I used, one of the characteristics is the black is like dark gray. It's not completely black. I quite like it. I like the film, the nostalgic film look in this one. But silhouettes can be very, very effective. Guide your eye. A silhouette by itself means it's high contrast because you've got a bright background and a dark foreground. So silhouettes are it's a really fun thing to do with black and white. And I think when you get the right scene, there's nothing that beats a good silhouette photo. Okay, so something that I really like doing. And very often, just as a side note, the conditions where you're getting silhouettes and where you can get really nice silhouettes are actually not very good for any other type of image. So basically, you've got a bright sky, you've got an underexposed subject, and to try and match that to not blow out the sky and get a subject properly exposed is really hard. And going to a silhouette can be quite nice. I see your comment. We'll touch on that just now as well. We're almost through the 5 tips. I'm definitely coming back to yours. That's an interesting question. Okay, so that's the first silhouette. Second one, again, backlit, nice silhouette. I quite like playing around with silhouettes. And yeah, definitely something to try with black and white. Another one, silhouettes can be, yeah, definitely. For instance, a big image like this on a wall or something um, just creates a really nice feel. And I think it's very effective in telling the story. And with the lighting conditions, it would be really hard doing anything else under these conditions. Very bright on the back with this tunnel. The background was very bright. It was very dark inside. So super tricky to do anything else. But underexposing and turning this into a silhouette was super effective. And then just making sure you get the correct angle so you can get nice profiles. Yeah, I think it's definitely something that's worth practicing, is getting good silhouettes. Great. That brings us to the end of the 5 tips. So right now, if you've got any questions, pop them in the chat. Anything, whether it's a question or just something that made you think or something you're going to be trying in the next week, let me know. I would like to see your comments on this. I love black and white, and I love seeing what people's ideas of black and white is. So I'm going to start going back to some of the questions we had. One we've got here is in photography terminology, can you simplify and minimalistic as the same? I think in a lot of cases it means it depends a little bit on your how you would define it, but I think a lot of photographers, a lot of people would use it very, very similar. So even outside of photography, I think it's related terms. So if I simplify my life, or if I try to have a more minimalistic life, my home or my office, simplifying something and having something more minimalistic could be very similar outcomes, I think. Um, yeah, so definitely related terms, but I think they can also be used a little bit differently. So um, if I think of, if somebody's home is minimalistic, there might not be much in the home. Whereas if it's simplified, there might be a bit more, but everything has a purpose, I would guess. And I think in photography, it could be similar. So when I'm simplifying a composition, I'm taking things away that's not needed. And everything that's left, I think, is part of what's needed in that story or that image. Minimalistic could just be completely white background with a black tree in it in the snow. Minimalistic could be absolutely just a complete black frame with one little subject or a house or something that's shining at night or something in it. So minimalistic could also be like super minimalistic, where there's almost nothing the frame. Where simplifying to me sometimes just means just take away some of the distracting stuff, or take the same image just from a different angle to have a bit of a simpler background or something. Yeah, but definitely related. If you're talking about simplifying and minimalistic approaches, could be similar, I think. That's my opinion. I would love to hear yours. Um, what else is there? Contrast really catches your eye. I agree. I love contrast. Um, somebody commented that one of the images had strong lines. I like lines. I like strong lines, especially in black and white images. Good. What else have we got? We've got a different question. somebody tried WhatsApp, tried WhatsApp on PC or laptop, and you don't seem to be winning. Can you comment what you're not winning with? Were you trying to share an image specifically to WhatsApp on desktop, or are you not getting it set up to actually work and read your WhatsApps? Um, a little bit of a different topic, but definitely it's something I use. I use it to share to the Joburg Photowalkers groups, images, and interact with people. It's very handy being able to type on a full-size keyboard and sharing images from my desktop computer that I exported from Lightroom. So it's relevant. It's relevant to photography. Um, yeah. If you can expand a little bit on what the trouble is with WhatsApp, maybe we can help you right here. Good. Any other questions? Any other observations about black and white? Um, good. Any questions about the process, the settings, things to try? Anything at all? Just pop questions or comments in the chat. Okay. So you can't get it to set up. Yeah, that's a bit of a different one. So basically, you need to open WhatsApp on your desktop. If you installed the app on your desktop, you need to open it. You need to go to the settings on your phone and basically get it linked up. Usually, it's as easy as scanning a QR code. Get it linked up. Good luck with that. It does help sharing photos and interacting with photography groups, being able to do it on the desktop. Sure, you can get it set up quite quickly. Good. Anything else about black and white, monochrome, questions, settings? Let me know. I'm gonna give it a couple of seconds, and then if there's no questions or comments, we will keep going. Oh yes, okay, we've got a comment or question. Did you use something like Nick Silver effects? Is it easy to master? Nick Silver effects is very powerful when it comes to black and white editing, and a lot of people who, especially people who shoot exclusively black and white, uses Nick Silver effects. There's some amazing effects you can get, some form simulations, all sorts of things you can do with black and white. There's a lot of options. There's a lot of like looks, pre-made looks. There's a lot of things you can set when it comes to Nick Silver effects. Um, so even if you use Nick Silver effects inside of something like Lightroom Classic, it could be overwhelming for a lot of people. It is. And then also getting to a specific look, very often I find that these days just with Lightroom I can get a similar look. I can get to where I want to be, and to me Lightroom is a little bit less intimidating and easier to work with than Nick Silver effects. So I would say if you are technically minded, you like editing, you really know your way around something like Lightroom, and you want a new challenge and a new tool to use, Nick Silver effects is really good. But if you're a beginner photographer, if you just started out editing your images, you're not comfortable with something like Lightroom, I would say for a start, don't use it. Just use Lightroom. Get to know what all the sliders do. Really figure out what does the highlight slider do? What does the contrast slider do? What does the black and white sliders do? How are they different? As soon as you understand all these things, you can then apply some of the effects in Nick Silver effect after you're really comfortable, and then know where to adjust to get specific looks as well. Like I said, it's very powerful, but especially for beginners, it can be a bit intimidating. So yeah, I think. Oh, that's my opinion. I like Nick Silver effects. Lately, I don't really use it anymore, but I used to use it quite a bit more, and yeah, it's definitely powerful. Good. Yeah, no, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining. What you've noticed with black and white pics is the contrast is almost to the extreme. Yeah. I don't know. I don't know if your comment is about your black and white images where you're dialing your contrast almost to the extreme, or if you're noticing it in general in black and white images. So I think a lot of that comes from a lot of the film stock that people used to use when they were shooting 35mm film. So something like Kodak, one would it be? The 400 ISO Kodak, the Tri-X. Something like Tri-X was very contrasty just by the nature of the film. The way they did the chemicals, the way your images came out was quite contrasty in a lot of cases. So I think a lot of people, when they're thinking about black and white, they still think about some of those films that were quite contrasty. Um, uh, we had some more less, or some of the films were less contrasty, maybe something like a Neopan, a lot less contrasty. So there were these more like you'd find a lot of shades of gray and more midtones. But I think in general, a lot of black and white images, they just look better with some added contrast. So when you're taking a perfect edit on a color image, convert it to black and white, very often if you just dial up the contrast a bit, it even looks better. It just enhances that contrast between the dark areas and the bright areas. And I think it does good things for images, but it doesn't work for every single one. Sometimes going the opposite way is also worth looking at and seeing what you want to do. But yeah, in general, I think what you would find when people are posting black and white and they're doing a lot of black and white, most of it would be high contrast. I think it just gives a nice effect and a specific effect people are looking for. And it enhances the feel of black and white if you do high contrast black and white. So very often I would set my camera and up the contrast quite a bit when I'm shooting black and white, just because it enhances that look. So let's say you get a shadow and a triangle of light next to it. If you're shooting high contrast, that light area is going brighter, the shadow area is going darker, and you enhance that effect. So yeah, I think it's definitely a lot. You'll find that black and white images are edited, or camera settings are set to have a lot more contrast in general than you would find with color images. With color, if you up the contrast too much, you're also upping the saturation. It can do funny things to skin tones, and images start looking bad. So I think people are less inclined to up the contrast a lot when it comes to color. And in black and white, you don't get that effect, but it actually very often does good things. So that's why you would notice that. Right. What's next? There's a question on the WhatsApp group on black and white. Let me check the WhatsApp group. Do it. Second. Good. Is black and white photography better than RAW or JPEG? So you could do black and white photography in either one. So a raw image by its nature is what the sensor captures. So you're getting color, but as you edit this out, you could edit this out to black and white. So you can start with a raw image and end up with a black and white. Absolutely. So that's legit. Very often when I shoot black and white, I like saving a JPEG, because then I'm getting whatever I apply in my camera. So if I do higher contrast and I do settings that enhances my black and white image, I get that in the JPEG and it's built in and it's already there saved to the card, which I like. So I think being able to view the result easier also on your camera, on the back of your camera while you're out and about, JPEG is definitely it's got its benefits, especially with shooting black and white. It's got definitely has a place, I think. So yeah, you could do either one. You could save both if you want more leeway, for in case afterwards you want to change things in edits. But I like definitely. Personally, I think I shoot more. I would tend to go to JPEG more often when I'm shooting black and white specifically than I would for color. For color, I percentage-wise, I might shoot more raw than JPEG, and black and white it might be the other way around. I think definitely, especially if your camera's got some nice film simulations and can do all sorts of nice monochrome modes and filters and things, and the built-in red, orange, green filters, color filters that you can apply. I think all these things go out the window as soon as you edit the raw, and you have to reapply a lot of these things in the edit, where you can just get them in the JPEG all done. So yeah, I like JPEG. So we've got another Yeah, we've got a comment. Somebody saying, yeah, you get more data as you save the raw. So that's um, if you do raw plus JPEG, you've got both. You've got both options. If you need that extra data, you can go back to the raw. If your JPEG looks good, just use the JPEG. But very often you can change the dynamic range of your camera. You can darken down highlights. So you can move highlights and shadows on most digital cameras. So if you want more dynamic range and you're thinking, oh, I need to shoot raw to get all that dynamic range so I can edit better and have details in shadows and details in highlights, on most digital cameras, you can get very similar result by decreasing contrast or dropping highlights, upping shadows in your settings, even or setting things like some cameras have got active de-lighting that you can switch on that compresses the dynamic range down. Some cameras have got active lighting, I think they call it. Fuji calls it DR100, DR200, DR400, or auto, so it changes the dynamic range. So basically all it does is it takes all the info and you can tell it to actually compress it down to the JPEG and not cut it off and lose it. So previously, when RAW was sort of new in digital cameras, people said you have to shoot RAW, otherwise it's throwing away that highlight detail, it's throwing away the shadow detail, and it's gone forever in the JPEG. It's true, but on the newer cameras, you can actually adjust it so that it doesn't throw that very bright detail and dark detail away. It actually moves it into what the JPEG can handle, and you still get those details. The JPEG, yes, if you do extreme edits, it might fall apart a little bit in the edit, but you can do general adjustments to a JPEG just as easily as to a RAW. You get a bit more leeway to adjust things in the RAW, but it's up to you. If you want to spend more time editing, start from the RAW. If you trust your camera and your settings, it's very often a lot faster, and sometimes I find it more, it's more satisfying capturing it in the JPEG correctly and knowing that I had my settings correct and I don't need all that leeway that the RAW gives me. It's almost like shooting film. You've got your chance and you need to make the settings work. So I would say do both, and especially if it's for your own photography, try JPEG. You'd be surprised how far you can actually get with editing on JPEGs, and how much you will learn about photography and your camera settings doing JPEG. Because a lot of what's in your camera menu is actually only baked in to the JPEG. If you're saving a RAW, a lot of the settings on your camera that you can actually set is irrelevant because you're setting that afterwards in Lightroom. So I think a lot of the nice things that cameras can do these days will only be applicable if you save a JPEG. But like I said, you've got the option of saving both. So, all good. Good. Any more questions? Let me just double check the WhatsApp while we're there. I think that was the comment there. All good. Everybody happy? Then we're going to call it an evening. Thank you for joining, everybody. I appreciate you joining again. The WhatsApp group is still there. If you've got any questions afterwards, if you need any tips or settings or whatever advice, just pop it in the WhatsApp group. Always happy to help. And go and try some of these tips. Spend some time with black and white. It definitely improved my photography doing that. I'm sure it can do that for yours. Keep warm, and I hope the load shedding is not bothering you too much. Have a great evening, everybody. Cheers.